"I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty that still remains." These are the words of an extraordinary young girl, whose words have provided light in one of the darkest chapters of human history. They are the words of Annelies Marie Frank, more commonly known as Anne, and her life has become one of the most iconic in recent history, as she recorded the events surrounding her family and their ultimately doomed effort to escape the persecution of the Nazis as they cast their shadow over Europe during the first half of the 1940s. It is a story of youthful hope, the ordinary struggles of everyday adolescent life against a far from ordinary backdrop of fear and persecution, and of surviving those extraordinary events, not just physically, but mentally. This is the tragic tale of Anne Frank. Welcome to Wars of the World. The story of Anne Frank's life would not begin in Holland, the nation in which her name is most associated, but actually in Frankfurt, for it is often forgotten by the wider public that she was in fact German by birth. She was born on June 12, 1929, at the Maingau Red Cross Clinic, the second daughter to Edith and Otto Heinrich Frank, with her older sister Margot being born 3 years earlier. During her very earliest years of life, the young Anne would have known little of the prejudices that faced Jews outside of her immediate world. For the Franks, being a liberal Jewish family that didn't practice some of the more stricter aspects of their faith, lived in a comparatively multicultural area of the city where both Jews and non-Jews lived and worked side by side. While she probably couldn't yet comprehend why, she was old enough to know that in 1933, at the age of 4 years old, that things had started to change for her family. That, of course, was the year that Adolf Hitler and his band of Nazi thugs rose to power in Germany and began transforming the previous German Weimar Republic into the Third Reich, with all its talk of purity and hatred towards those who didn't meet their standards. The most noticeable change for Anne came when shortly afterwards, she, along with her mother and sister, relocated to Aachen in the extreme west of Germany, staying with her grandmother, while her father remained in Frankfurt to tend to the family's affairs, something that grew increasingly difficult as the Nazis began their crackdowns on the Jewish people. Before long, the land the Franks had known as their home became unrecognizable, and worse still, openly hostile to their kind. And so when an offer came to start a business in Amsterdam, Otto Frank embraced the opportunity. Having gone ahead, he found himself joining a growing community of German Jewish refugees settling in the city. Eventually, he found a home for his family in Merverde Square in the Rivierenbuurt neighborhood. Holding on to their more liberal views, Edith and Otto decided to send their children to the Dutch state schools, with Anne attending the nearby 6th Montessori school. The Montessori method of education is a type of educational method that involves children's natural interests and activities, rather than a more formal teaching method. A Montessori classroom places an emphasis on hands-on learning and developing real-world skills, promoting independence while discouraging some conventional measures of achievement, such as grades and tests, to gauge a child's progress. It was a form of education that was increasingly being curtailed back in Germany, for the Nazi ideals demanded obedience, and that required indoctrination, with no room for independent thought. However, this was an ideal educational environment for Anne, with Anne proving to be an enthusiastic student, but as Otto would recall, sometimes her naturally inquisitive nature was sometimes a troublesome trait. As he recalled, quote, "She would constantly ask questions, not just when we were alone, but also when others were present. If we had visitors, it was rather difficult to get rid of her, because she was interested in everything and everyone." End quote. Despite initially struggling with the Dutch language, it was not long before Anne and Margot were speaking fluently with their classmates. As a student, her teachers noticed that she often struggled with subjects such as arithmetic and the sciences, but embraced the more creative ones, such as art and music, although she didn't excel in either. She was, however, fascinated with history and how it shaped the modern world in which she lived. However, in that regard, both the staff and the parents of the children agreed to avoid discussions regarding the events in Germany for fear of upsetting the large German Jewish student body. On January 31st, 1938, the Dutch royal family welcomed the arrival of Princess Beatrix, and in accordance with Dutch tradition, Anne and her fellow classmates were treated to rusks with aniseed comfits. As the 1930s passed by and she grew in age, her first feelings of love blossomed when she met Lutz Peter Schiff, a slightly older boy who she described as tall, handsome, and having something of a cheeky glint in his eye whenever he smiled, which he found utterly appealing. Later on in her diaries, she would reminisce fondly about the times they would travel home from school with one another, walking innocently hand in hand. Yet despite her family's efforts to escape the persecution of Hitler and his thugs, the Third Reich was never far away, and not just politically. Their reach continued to extend outwards, both militarily and politically, throughout the 1930s, until finally it ignited the storm clouds of war. Following the invasion of Poland and the start of hostilities between Nazi Germany and the Western powers of Britain and France, Holland declared its neutrality in the hopes that this would shield it from the fighting, as had happened in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. However, ultimately it was not for the Dutch to decide if they were to remain neutral, for their neutrality was solely dependent on the whims of the combatants, specifically Germany, and how they would view the small country in the months to follow. For Hitler, Holland became seen as a vital part of his war effort against his powerful Western enemies. It would provide him with bases along the coast to wage a maritime war against Britain, while at the same time anchor his right hook into France through Belgium, which also had declared its neutrality, allowing the German Wehrmacht to bypass the main French defensive line, the much flaunted but fundamentally flawed Maginot Line. Thus, on May 10th, 1940, Hitler's troops struck into the so-called Low Countries. The move caught the Western Allies by surprise, and despite promises by Britain and France for aid, their own efforts to block Hitler in Belgium had collapsed into a hastily organized retreat, leaving Holland to fend for itself. Shortly into the invasion, German bombers began to drone over the city of Rotterdam, unleashing their deadly loads onto the civilian population in an event now remembered as the Rotterdam Blitz. On May 14th alone, 711 people were killed, and the devastation was such that within a week, almost 85,000 people were left homeless, leading to waves of refugees flooding the roadsides, disrupting the movement of the Dutch troops, who were effectively left to put up little more than a token resistance. This was too much for the Dutch leadership, and on May 15th, Dutch troops were ordered to lay down their arms. The Dutch royal family fled to Britain, with many of them spending the duration of the war in the relative safety of Canada. The fall of Holland took place so quickly that few of its people had time to truly appreciate just what had happened, and more importantly, what was to happen next. This was especially true for the some 140,000 Jews then registered as living in Holland, of which around 1/6 had, like the Franks, emigrated from Germany to flee the very people who had now seemingly followed them westward, and for whom, with Western Europe being consumed by Hitler's tyranny, there was no further escape. They already knew the extent of Nazi persecution and believed they had a fair idea of what was to come. The truth, of course, would be so much worse. Hitler selected the Austrian Nazi Arthur Seyss-Inquart to assume the role of Reichskommissar for the occupied Dutch territories. Aiding him in enforcing the Nazi will on the Dutch population was Hans Albin Rauter, who assumed command of both Dutch and German law enforcement agencies in Holland. To discourage Dutch officials from neglecting their duties to identify all Jewish citizens in their assumed districts, the Germans paid bounties for every Jewish citizen they identified. Dutch Jewish leaders adopted a policy of cooperation when it came to the laws that were soon being imposed upon them, believing that resistance at this stage would only lead to harsher treatment. Nevertheless, others took it upon themselves to rally to their cause, when the first deportations to concentration camps began, resulting in a general strike in protest in February 1941. This strike was put down harshly, with its leaders labelled as communist agitators, and subsequently they were executed. The relocation of Dutch Jews saw the Jewish population in Amsterdam swell, as the Germans housed them within the city in preparation for their relocation to the camps. For the young Anne Frank, the biggest change to her daily life under the Nazis was that she was no longer allowed to attend the same school as non-Jewish children. But from her parents' perspective, this was only part of the segregation they, as Jews, were experiencing, and it only grew worse, until by 1942, Otto was actively trying to get his family out of Holland. His hope had been to travel to America, which was still neutral at the time, but his plans were dashed when Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, in support of his Japanese allies. The severing of diplomatic ties between the Third Reich and Washington closed the door on any plans of escape, and knowing that eventually the family was likely to be rounded up and deported to a camp, Otto decided that they had no choice but to eventually go into hiding, and so to that end, he began constructing a hiding place in the annex of his business. When Margot received instructions to report for deportation, the Frank family accelerated their plans, and on July 6th, they moved into the space that would hopefully provide them with sanctuary. Less than a month before the Frank family were forced to retreat into the annex, Anne received a very special gift on her 13th birthday of June 12, 1942. It was a diary for her to write in. At this formative age, Anne had already made it clear that she wished to pursue a career as a writer when she was older, even though at the time, a future in such a career for a Jewish person under Nazi occupation was slim. Yet with the diary, she could at least record the details of her life, unaware of the impact it would one day have on generations of people. Speaking of her aims with the diary, her first entry proclaimed distinctly, quote, "I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support." End quote. With those words, she began to chronicle her life, not just as a Jewish person on the run from the horrors of the Nazis, but with her experiences as the Franks, along with 4 other Jews, Herman and August van Pels, and their son Peter, as well as Fritz Pfeffer, hid in the annex. It's clear from the way that Anne began writing in her diary that the book became a substitute friend as she was cut off from her peers. She even imprinting something of a persona upon it, and with that came the name Kitty, a creation of hers inspired by a character from the popular Youthful series of books, written by Sissy van Marksveld, which Anne had started reading before going into hiding. Thus, many of the entries in her diary began with the words, "Dear Kitty," or at least to that effect, to give Anne the feeling that she was talking to someone. But Kitty was by no means the only persona. On the contrary, it seems that Anne's vivid imagination afforded her a circle of imaginary friends to whom she would write to as entries in the diary. As well as her correspondence to Kitty, other names that became the focus of entries included Pop, Vienne, Connie, Lou, Marianne, and Emmy. But as she would admit to Kitty in an entry, she enjoyed writing to her the most. Life in the annex lacked stimulation for a young mind. Routine was the order of business, revolving around cooking, cleaning, eating, sleeping, and basic maintenance. For Anne, this only fueled her imagination of a world free of the fear that the next time the bookshelf that hid the entrance slid open, it would not be the friendly face of those on the outside helping them by bringing food and supplies, but the dark, uncaring eyes of a Gestapo officer. In her mind, she fleshed out the character of Kitty, making her a 14-year-old girl in October 1942, and describing her as her best friend, conjuring stories of them together in a world outside of the annex. A world that she knew deep down could never be realized, but for one fleeting moment she could escape to in her mind. This no doubt helped her cope with not only the conditions, but at times the emotions in the annex. The space was hardly suited to housing 8 people, and supplies from their confidants on the outside were often disrupted by the growing restrictions placed on the Dutch population as the war dragged on. Tempers often flared amongst them, for no other reason than to vent their frustration over being effectively trapped and not knowing when, if ever, they could leave. It didn't help that Anne was at a difficult age, where she was growing into adolescence, and with all the problems that came with the changes to the female body. Being so close to him, she briefly pursued a romantic relationship with the Van Pels' son, Peter, leading her to reflect on her time with Lutz in a more innocent, earlier time. Anne did so much writing in her diary that it eventually filled up, forcing her to resort to using notebooks and scrap paper. Sadly, this resulted in much of her writings from 1943 being lost to time, and one can only speculate what might have happened in that time from entries she made from December of that year onwards. A new addition to her writings, later on in her time hiding in the annex, included the start of a novel inspired by her experiences with characters that were clearly based on those around her. Even then, she knew she had a story to tell, to educate and even warn future generations. She seemingly never lost sight of her ambition to write it, even in the darkest hours within the annex, as she wrote, quote, "I know what I want. I have a goal, an opinion. I have a religion and love." Further adding, "What is done cannot be undone, but one can prevent it happening again." End quote. On August 1st, 1944, Anne decided to write to Kitty to complain about how she was increasingly locking horns with those around her, feeling as though she were viewed as the naughty child of the group. She did regularly argue with her mother, as is so often the case with young teenage girls, and she frequently argued with Fritz Pfeffer over the use of the desk to write, leading her to name his character in her novel, Avel Dussel, the surname of which is German for idiot. She finished the entry with the following, quote, "Believe me, I'd like to listen, but it doesn't work. Because if I'm quiet and serious, everyone thinks I'm putting on a new act, and I have to save myself with a joke. And then I'm not even talking about my own family, who assume I must be sick, stuff me with aspirins and sedatives, feel my neck and forehead to see if I have a temperature, ask about my bowel movements, and berate me for being in a bad mood, until I just can't keep it up anymore. Because when everybody starts hovering over me, I get cross, and then sad, and finally end up turning my heart inside out, the bad part on the outside, and the good part on the inside, and keep trying to find a way to become what I'd like to be, and what I could be, if only there were no other people in the world. Yours, Anne M. Frank." End quote. These were the last known words written down by Anne. 3 days later, after 2 years, the day that they had all feared finally came.